So with this, I think we can get started. So Clementine, help me with moving to the next slide. Welcome everyone.
Oh, thing.
We're here for you guys to get a firsthand experience live from a real expert about what UX design is all about. And a little bit about General Assembly, like why are we here? Why are we partnering up with Google to bring you this class? We've been doing this for a long time now. We've been doing it for probably 11, 12 years. We've graduated about 100,000 more alumni from our different courses. We have four, not a lot, but we have four top disciplines: UX, data, coding, marketing. And about 73,000 of our grads are on LinkedIn. You can go to LinkedIn, search for General Assembly, check out where our grads are working at, check out in your country even, because we have courses worldwide. Clementine helps train people from the European, UK regions. We have trainers in the US, Canada, Australia. So we know what we're doing. We know what we're talking about. And we're experts in the live training format. We believe there's a key to it that brings real change. And today you're going to get a bit of a taste of what that looks like by learning about UX and about doing an exercise about how UX designers think. Let's move to the next slide, please. And Clementine here is the expert on UX design. This is great for you all because you get to hear from someone that lives and breathes UX design, that also trains professionals to work on UX design, which is amazing. She is a lead UX designer at GA, but also a principal product designer at Red Badger. So she knows what she's talking about. This is not just theory, this is theory and practice. And she's been doing this for a long time. She's seen the changes. She's seen what has stuck through the years in UX, what hasn't changed. I really encourage you all to make some really good questions about what UX could mean for you, what tools are needed, what are the top skills. Any questions you have, please drop it on the chat. One note though, for the questions, we're going to make space at the end, but if you have any questions as we go, write them down on the chat and then I will make a copy of that question and make sure we get through all of them at the end. If for some reason we see that the question is very relevant for the topic we're reviewing, we'll make a pause and Clementine will attend it. But again, be sure to share any questions on the chat. I'll be moderating, I'll be helping you all. And with this, welcome everyone. I'm gonna pass it over to Clementine to take it on from here. Wish you all the best.
Thank you. Yeah, welcome everyone. That was a great intro. I'd encourage you to hop in the chat and say hi, maybe like where you are in the world. I think we have a super international audience with us today. Also, maybe like why you're interested in UX or what you think UX is, any kind of topics of conversation if you want to. So yes, my name's Clementine. I am a product designer. I've been designing since a long time ago. So before even the first smartphone, which has been amazing because I've got to see the evolution of digital design from static websites through this entire responsive revolution to designing for watches, for all kinds of interfaces and all kinds of sizes, which has been really, really great. I specialized in digital about 20 years ago because I realized that's where my passion was. I was like a graphic designer, I guess you'd call it, before then. So I was doing print work, branding, websites, but actually digital is where my heart lies. I've been teaching at General Assembly since 2016, so for 8 years now. It's like it's one of my favorite things to do because they always say like the best way to learn something is to teach it to somebody else. So while I was designing and learning, I was then teaching other people design and learning more myself. So I think GA is a really great place the thing I think is most valuable about it is that all of the instructors are practitioners. So it's not like we don't work full time for GA. We are actual practitioners who are doing this job every single day, which I think makes it different and stands apart from other training providers and also traditional institutions like universities, etc. So yeah, I'm excited that you're here, and I hope that this is a good kind of intro and start to your UX journey. So what we're going to do today, I'm just going to run through a couple of kind of orientation slides just before we get started. So we're obviously on Google Meet, you guys are all here. Please do use the chat. If you are thinking about any questions or anything while we're going through the presentation, drop them in there. If I've got the chat open too, so I'll try and keep my eye on it. It's not always possible, but then those questions will get called out at the end if I miss it during our chat together. So yeah, use the chat box. Click raise hand. I'm not sure that we're going to be doing that today because there are so many people, but I would just encourage you to drop your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them. And if there's anything that's super exciting or interesting, then do feel free to use the reactions to let us know. So this is roughly how the class is going to run. I say roughly because I'm pretty terrible at timings, and sometimes we might end up talking about something for longer than the other thing. But we'll talk about what is UX design, definitely, like defining it a bit, talking about its history, figuring out what UX actually means. A bit about what it's like to be a UX designer. I can speak to that quite well, but also just kind of generally what you'll find yourself doing in the UX world. And then we are going to actually run through kind of a bit of a cycle of actually doing some UX design. So there'll be a couple of activities just for you to do on your own, but they'll build on each other, and then you can have something to do after class as well. Have paper and some kind of pen, pencil, charcoal, whatever you like, ready. That is happening after the break, so you will have chance to get that. But yeah, just have that ready because you'll be doing some sketching and writing down some questions and things like that. And then we'll have time for questions at the end. So I'll make sure that we leave space for that. So that's what we're going to be having a look at. This is kind of a beginner's class, so some of you might already have a bit of experience in this area, and if you feel like it, if I'm saying something that you agree with or disagree with or have a different experience, then please do also share that in the chat, because this is a collaborative learning environment. So if you have something to say that you think other people might benefit from, please do feel free to share that as well. One thing that I always say with UX design is the answer to pretty much every question is it depends, because there's always more than one variable that's impacting on your decision making. So sharing experiences that you've had is going to be valuable, absolutely. And then we will be sharing a recording of this. If you fill out the survey at the end, because that helps us, then you will get a link to the recording. All right, so if everyone is ready, I'm just going to steam ahead and start talking about UX design and what it is. I mean, there's no real one definition. There are certain experts who we look to. They've written definitions of what they believe UX is that we can say, yeah, that hits the nail pretty much on the head. But again, it depends what UX actually ends up being. But this is always going to be true. Like, we all know what a bad experience looks like. Some of you may have this problem on the left-hand side. I've got one right here, actually, an Apple mouse. You can't use it while it's charging. Steve Jobs is rolling in his grave. I don't know what decision-making process went into that, but it's bad form. Why? I just don't know. And the other one on the right-hand side, you probably all have had an experience of approaching a door and not actually knowing whether you should push or pull. Like in this photo here, it's a little hard to see, but there's a pull handle on both sides of this door, which obviously cannot work from one of the sides, right? Because it's either push or it's pull. And this is, if you're a nerd like me, something that UX designers refer to as a Norman door. We're going to learn a little bit about Don Norman in a minute, but he wrote a book called The Design of Everyday Things, which I recommend you get your hands on if you haven't read it and you're really interested. And he was talking about this. So he's like, as a UX designer, it's our job to make people or help people do what they need to do as quickly and easily as possible. So designing something like this, where you introduce confusion, there is a simple solution to not having this, is just bad UX. We just should not be designing things in this way. And then this is an example from the digital arena. This is actually one of my favorite websites of all times. It is just lingscar.com if you want to pop open a new tab and take a look. And it is this guy who rents out cars. Unbelievably does amazing business, because it's kind of, as you can see from this website, like kind of a cult type thing. Like, this website doesn't look like any other car rental websites that you'll find out there. And because of that, people talk about it, which means that people go there and actually do use this website. And it's in here as an example of bad UX design, because, well, I mean, where do you look first, right? That's one of the fundamental questions of UX, is kind of like, when you are using a digital product, you have a goal in mind, you have something that you want to do or an outcome that you want to get to. And when you open a digital product to help you achieve that goal, you should know what you need to do. And it's very hard on this website to have a look. So in terms of UX definitions, I've got a couple in here. So this one, user experience design, is a way of thinking and an approach to the design of products and services that looks beyond the design of the artifact itself to the experience it delivers to the people who use it. It's kind of a mouthful. But this guy, Jesse James Garrett, he founded Adaptive Path, that was then bought by somebody big. But he is a very prolific kind of speaker and writer in this arena. If you follow him on X, then he's constantly tweeting lots of things of value and opinions and thoughts on the current state of UX design and what's going on in the world. So he's quite a good one to follow. And I do agree with what he's saying here. Like, UX design is definitely a way of thinking. It is a mindset. Because it's so hard to pin down, there isn't even one kind of industry recognized single definition of UX design, because it exists in so many different forms. But I definitely agree that it is a mindset. It's not actually a thing. You can't pin it down. It's a way of thinking. And he's speaking here about, it's beyond the design. So it's not just what your interface looks like. It's the whole experience that somebody has when they're interacting with you and what you provide them, which I also think is very true. One analogy that works quite well for UX is that UX is like the weather. There's never no weather, and what weather it is will impact how much you notice it and what you think about it. It's the same with UX design. There's never no UX. Like, there's always an experience that you have with everything that you do in life. And how good or bad that experience is will impact how you react to the situation, and what you do. So it's very much like the weather. So those were some bad examples. This is a good example. I think, again, like, bad examples are kind of easier to come across than good examples, because actually, what does good look like? But I think that Airbnb, this is something that you could possibly class as a good example, because there are a lot of features and it enables the user to do a lot of things in a lot of different ways. Sometimes that can be a bad thing as well, because if you've got lots of choice of how to do something, then sometimes you can just not do it because you don't know which way is going to be the best way to do something. I mean, this is really why it depends, right? Because for somebody who is tech savvy, using something like Airbnb can be quite a pleasurable, good experience, because you may have grown up with tech, so you'll understand all of the signifiers and what you can do with everything on this page. But again, it depends, because contextually, if you're perhaps somebody who hasn't grown up with tech, you're not going to necessarily understand that, for example, like the three lines next to your avatar profile is actually a menu, and you can click on that to open that up. So yeah, good example, but also could be bad depending on context. And another thing about UX, context is king. But this is definitely not Ling's cars. So in terms of what UX is, it's a mindset. It's very dependent on a lot of other things in the situation. So how did we really get here? How did we get to have UX as this kind of really important, pivotal part of a digital company's way of thinking? So I'm just going to run through kind of a quick potted history of, I guess, significant events in the evolution of what we now call user experience design. So if I was to actually pose the question to you, when do you think is like one of the very first examples of UX design that we can point to? I think people will come up with several different answers. I ask this to every class that I teach, and there's generally a variety of responses, and there's none of them are wrong. A lot of people do say like when the internet happened, or when computers became more in everyone's houses and things like that. And I've had one student actually who said the wheel, which again, like, I mean, that's not wrong either, because that's something that was designed to help people do things more quickly and more easily than they currently could. So when we're talking about UX design, we're not necessarily just talking about the digital realm. One example that I do like to point to is actually Leonardo da Vinci. Because back in 1430, the Duke of Milan was having a really big, high-profile feast with a lot of guests, basically. And he went to Da Vinci and he said to him, how do I do this? How do I actually build a kitchen that will get all of the food out roughly at the same time so that we can all eat together at this huge banquet? And as you all will know, Da Vinci was a prolific inventor. And he actually invented the first documented instance of a conveyor belt when he was given this brief. So UX also can be the mother of invention. But he invented this conveyor belt because he identified, I guess, a problem, a usability problem with the way kitchens currently existed, in that everything was in its place. And as somebody who was making food, you had to move around the kitchen quite a lot. So he thought, how about if everybody stays still so that they don't bump into each other all the time in a big kitchen that's going to be very busy preparing all this food, and we actually have a conveyor belt that brings the plates to people. So you have it basically like a Kanban system, like every person is responsible for doing one thing and one thing only, like a production line for food. And the reason that this is interesting for us in UX, because that's kind of people focused thinking, and that wasn't massively popular at the time. So he was thinking about how the people in the kitchen were going to interact with the tools they had to use in order to provide the end user, the guests at the feast, with a pleasurable experience. So there were lots of things going on in this. I think it's a good example. It was actually a complete disaster because Leonardo da Vinci had also invented, or there also was in place, a rudimentary sprinkler system, and his conveyor belt actually caught fire and the sprinklers went off and it ruined everything. But it's a really good example of thinking about the user in the context of using something and having that type of experience. Moving rapidly forward from the 1430 up to 1900, we can't really talk about UX without talking about the revolution of production, I guess. So Frederick Winslow Taylor, he was a mechanical engineer, and he's widely considered to be one of the first management consultants, I guess. And Henry Ford, who, of course, Ford Motor Cars. So Henry Ford pioneered like mass production techniques, and Winslow Taylor was also interested in that. So he wrote a book called The Principles of Scientific Management, which really was talking about how things need to change and we need to focus more on how people are using things, not just on what people need to do with them. And Henry Ford, his mass production techniques was really pushing forward the idea of how people interact with their tools. And he was really very concerned with how laborers would use the machinery that they were given. He's also responsible for one of the I don't know whether he did say it, maybe it's just like a legend, but one of the principles that we think about when we are doing usability testing and user research, which is his quote: "If I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses," which we look to as an illustration of we can't just ask users what they want because they don't know what's possible. In Ford's era, people didn't necessarily know that a motor car was something they could have. And it's just the same today, especially when you're thinking about the context of artificial intelligence and virtual and augmented reality. You can't just ask people, like, what do you want this thing to do for you? Because they won't know what's possible or what it could do. So it's quite important. It's just a nice little synergy. So these guys were important in the journey of thinking about how people actually interact with things. Hot off the heels was Toyota. I don't know if any of you are in like the product industry, digital product industry, or delivery, but Toyota has a very famous book called The Toyota Way, which is kind of the foundation of Kanban. If you're not familiar with Kanban, it's a way of working that is used quite a lot in digital product companies, in the agile arena and things like that. These are all buzzwords that if you're not familiar with them, Google them later and you'll get a clearer picture of what actually happens in digital product environments. But Toyota was really interested in reducing waste. And this is where some of the terminology that we use in product, for example, lean UX is like I guess a way of thinking in UX, which is basically about reducing waste. And Toyota was really enthusiastic about doing this in his factories. So essentially what that manifested as was him recognizing that, yes, on a production line from Henry Ford, you can make, if you just have like one person making one thing, you can make a lot of them very quickly. But what he did was take it a step further and kind of think about, okay, I don't want one person to make one thing day in, day out. I want them to make that thing in the context of the bigger thing that's being built. So that's where Kanban comes from. It's like this person does this thing, it moves on to the next person who does their thing, and moves on to the next person who does their thing. So therefore, everybody who's doing their own individual part of the process can see the article as it currently is and can identify if there are any issues with their particular part or with the thing that their part fits into. So yeah, this is a really important step in the process. What he also did was actually empower the laborers in the factories to bring people's attention, like bring management's attention to any defects. And this is really kind of what Agile does in software and digital product development and delivery, is if you're making things in small parts and they don't fit together with the other parts around it, you can very quickly see that, rather than having everything put together and at the end being like, oh, it doesn't work, why doesn't it work? So he actually, it was called an and-on chord. So he came up with this basically just like a big rope that was strung around the production line, that anybody who worked there could pull on this rope. It would stop the production line. Management would all come down from the offices. Everyone would get together, see what the problem is, and come up with a solution. So rather than a headlight being faulty and making 500 of these faulty headlights because they weren't actually being installed at the time they were made, you make one headlight, you install it, you figure out it's not working, what's the problem, something in the headlight, change it, then you've only got one faulty headlight, not 500 of them. So that's the basic principle. So Toyota, the Toyota Way, again, another interesting read if you're into this kind of arena. If you're interested in product management, this is also spoken about there, or like delivery management and things like that. But it's important to us because it's really about how we work as part of a team, and we design small parts and very quickly hook them up with bigger parts so we can make sure that everything's working as we want it to. So then just a decade on into the 1950s, this is the title of a book, Designing for People. So this was written by a guy called Henry Dreyfus. And it's a really pivotal text in terms of thinking about how people interact with the products that we're making for them. And the reason that I like to include this in the history is because it has a paragraph that I think is really important, and often a principle that gets overlooked by, well, quite a lot of stakeholders that I've encountered in my career. But it's kind of around the concept of friction. So this is the quote. When the point of contact between the product and the people becomes a point of friction, then the industrial designer has failed. On the other hand, if people are made safer, more comfortable, more eager to purchase, more efficient, or just plain happier by contact with the product, then the designer has succeeded. So it's not, the phrase isn't actually here, but in the second paragraph, he's talking about something that we call positive friction. And you may have heard in the industry, people talking about wanting a frictionless experience, which sounds amazing and sounds like something we should be providing for our users. Because again, it speaks to our principle of wanting to help people do things as quickly and easily as possible, which is still our mission. But what he's talking about here is the fact that actually, if you do introduce some friction on purpose to make people safer, more comfortable, etc., then that is also a good thing. So that's positive friction. An example that I use quite often is Amazon, because most people have an Amazon account, and most people have also lived in more than one place since they've had their Amazon account. And if you go through the Amazon checkout process, I mean, often there isn't really one. Like once you've set an address and once you've added a card, that is what Amazon will default to. So you can just click buy now without having to enter any information, which sounds amazing, and most of the time is amazing because it's very fast. What can happen is if you have lived in multiple places, or for example, my job is I'm a consultant, so I will work on lots of different client sites throughout a year, and I might get things delivered to their offices, obviously because I'm not at home. So then I have a bunch of addresses in my Amazon account, and if Amazon is so eager to make me buy something that it doesn't ask me to check whether I'm sending something to the right address, then I can get that thing delivered to the wrong place where I don't work anymore, or I'm not going there, etc. Probably some of you on the call have had this happen. So that's really a very basic, but nonetheless an illustration of how positive friction can be good. So if Amazon had a mechanism to slow you down, to make you confirm that was the correct address, then a lot more people would make less mistakes. That was a silly way of saying it, but people would make less mistakes, essentially. So that's what he's talking about. And I think it's really important as digital designers. Yes, we want to design a frictionless experience, but also recognizing that positive friction can still make users just as happy as a frictionless experience. And then moving on into the 70s, Park, personal computers, this is when it was all happening. I'm really sad I wasn't alive and conscious to know that this was going on, because I think it would have been a really interesting time to live in. But the Park was basically the research arm of Xerox. So yeah, photocopier people. But they invested quite a lot in research in how people were going to be using their machines, and in the ecosystem of the company, and in terms of personal computing. So this guy in this photo here is actually a guy called Bob Taylor. He was a psychologist first, and then he also trained as an engineer. And he was working at Park, and he actually kind of is credited with designing the first graphical user interface. So pre to this point, computers were basically just text based. So you'd use like a command line. If any of you are coders, you'll be very familiar. You just use text to control what your computer did. And then Park in the 70s came up with a graphical user interface, and as a result of that, the first mouse, so that you could actually point and click, and you didn't have to tell the computer what to do by typing all of the text to give it the instructions. There's a scene, if some of you have seen the movie about Steve Jobs, where he goes to Park and he sees the graphical user interface and basically goes back to Apple and says, we're not launching another computer until we have one of these. And that's what happened. He went there, he looked at their research, he was like, this is going to change the game. Because at that point, people were still thinking that computers didn't really have a place in the households. They weren't really going to be that useful for individuals. They were still much more of a mechanical thing, that only engineers, software engineers, had the knowledge to use. And he recognized that this was going to open it up to the whole world. And then on the back of that, when computers did become popular, it was recognized that actually there needed to be some principles, and there needed to be some ways for people to understand what was going on. So actually designing interfaces became much, much more important than it had been. So in the 90s, it was kind of the rise of design thinking. Some of you may have heard of design thinking. And it basically came out of Stanford University, and then was popularized by this organization called IDEO. I'm sure that some of you are familiar, but definitely check them out. They're like a kind of thought leadership in this arena. And they do a lot of good work. And they basically popularized design thinking, which was really giving a process to the act of designing. Before this, designing was pretty opaque, and I think some people still think it's kind of opaque. Sometimes people still refer to it as like ideas go into the design black box and then they come out fully formed. People still call it like, oh, I'll just wave your magic wand and make something look good, because they don't necessarily understand everything that goes into design. We're still having those battles today, but design thinking at least did give designers a framework upon which they could hand their process and therefore explain what they were doing to stakeholders and other members of their teams. We'll look at design thinking in a bit more detail as we go through the course today. We're going to run activities based on the process. And the Don Norman, who is like the grandfather of UX design, worked with IDEO and with design thinking, and kind of started then pushing that even further forward. So he's the guy who wrote the book called The Design of Everyday Things that I was talking about when we were looking at the doors that had a pull handle on both sides. So definitely pick up that book. And basically he's talking about I guess form over function again, that like we tend to design things so that they look good but not necessarily work well. And he's talking about as designers, and specifically user experience designers, we should be thinking the other way around. We should design something to work and then help that thing that works really well also look good. He was a psychologist. He was brought into a lot of situations to try and figure out what happened. If any of you have a Netflix subscription still, there's a documentary on 3 Mile Island on Netflix that's really interesting. He writes about it in his book. Essentially, there was a nuclear power point that went into near meltdown. And he was, as a psychologist, brought in afterwards to figure out what happened and why did that nearly happen. And he basically ended up saying, well, the manuals are written by the engineers who built the machine, not for the people who are actually going to be operating the machine. So they couldn't understand what the manual was saying when they were trying to fix the problem. And that's kind of what our job is as user experience designers, is like, we're building all these tools for people to use, but if we're designing them in a way that makes sense to us, but our users aren't going to necessarily understand, then we're going to fail, basically. So he has this is the second of the two kind of definitions of UX design I mentioned earlier. So he said, I invented the term, because he did actually invent the term user experience design, because I thought human interface and usability were too narrow. I wanted to cover all aspects of the person's experience with the system. And this is really born out of his research as a psychologist. And again, back to the manual in 3 Mile Island, he's like, you need to think about the entire experience, not just looking at the control panel and understanding what to do, but understanding why it works that way, what is actually being shown to you. It's every aspect of the process. In 2024, quite often we will break this process down and have kind of other disciplines, I guess, that work with UX designers, and we'll talk about those in a minute, like UI designers, service designers, things like that. What is the difference? But we're all working towards the same goal. So just thinking about the end-to-end life cycle of a user, from the very first time they see an advert for our product to their kind of end of life with us, when they cancel their subscription or return their product or whatever they do. User experience is the whole thing, not just the digital part in the middle. And another really good example of this, which was a project by IDEO. This is a very famous example, and some of you may have heard this. But when IDEO, talking about design thinking, were really popularizing the fact that it's not just about, again, digital products. It can have real life important impacts for human beings. This image is an MRI machine, which they're very heavy. Most of the time they're in the basement because they're so heavy. So you kind of go down, you're out of daylight, you're in this very sterile environment. And a hospital actually approached IDEO and said, hey, we have a children's MRI machine, and we need a way to help the kids relax while they're having this scan, because they were realizing that they were sedating about 80% of the patients, which is not great. Like, you don't want to sedate anyone if you don't have to. Also, it's a child. It's distressing for them. It's distressing for their caregivers. It's not that nice for the like doctors and nurses around them. And they went to IDEO and they said, how can we get these kids to stop being so scared, basically? So IDEO actually ran the design thinking process, focusing on that particular problem, and came out with stickers, basically. So, I mean, it's more than that, but they basically said, if you build a narrative around this, if you tell a story, if you give the kids pirate costumes, if you give caregivers, nurses and doctors kind of scrubs that are costumes, build the story around it, and then some part of the story means that they have to lie still for the 7 minutes that the MRI takes, you'll have a better chance of getting them to do it, because it's not a scary thing anymore and they're just taking part in the story. And they did it, and it worked, and the sedation rate went down from 80% to 3%, which is huge. I mean, normally when we're trying to optimize things from a UX perspective, we're looking at a 1 to 5 percentile improvement, but going from 80% down to 3% was just giant. And it's a really good example of how thinking about a process from the perspective of how it's designed can have a really big impact on very important parts of human lives. So that's why I say check out IDEO, because they do a lot of work like this. They've got lots of interesting case studies, and they're good to know about. So on to the next thing. I think that's a good illustration, I guess, of this, that like UX design, like I asked at the beginning when I said, when would you say was like a good first example of UX design, is often people do think about it just in the context of digital products. But really, it's a lot more than that. Yes, it's digital. Like all of the work I do is in the digital arena, but I don't work for IDEO. But it means, it shows that the way that we think about things, so the mindset that we were talking about at the beginning, is applicable to lots of different scenarios. So there's a link in these slides when you get them after this presentation to the YouTube video to kind of watch the case study of how this project evolved, which is very interesting. So I said just now that we were going to talk a little bit about the kind of different job roles in UX, like user experience design. It's the end-to-end process, but within that, we do segment the things that we're focusing on depending on what they are, and using different disciplines to do that. So we have user interface designers as well as user experience designers. This example here, UI is the interface that you actually interact with a spoon, to UX, which is the experience. So how well that spoon actually enables you to achieve your goal of eating the cereal. So it's the interface versus the experience. Usability and user experience is another one that people often ask about. Usability is how well can someone actually accomplish their goal, and user experience is, well, here it says the most delightful experience, but user experience is measuring what kind of experience people are having. Eating cereal with a spoon versus eating cereal with a fork, you'll achieve your goal of eating the cereal, but the experience will be different because they're different types of interfaces. And that's interesting and important, because what you do, what do you want to go into when you're thinking about user experience design, can be different depending on what you're thinking about when you're thinking about user experience design. So you can have UX designers who might be more interface focused, and that's where you might find people building artifacts like wireframes, things like that. And then you can have user experience researchers who do the research that backs up the design of the interface. So there is a lot of crossover. It's basically just one huge Venn diagram, and there are parts of each role that cross over with other roles. So as we go through doing the activities that we're going to be doing this afternoon, have a think about what you are actually enjoying and what you're not enjoying so much as well, because that can help give you a bit of direction into what type of role you think you'd enjoy in this arena. Myself personally, I'm very much more interface focused. So I do a lot more of the interface and the UI than I do of research. I'm almost like, I care a lot about the research, but I don't care for doing the research. I like someone to do the research and then tell me the results, so then I can apply that to the interface. So there are lots of different ways that you can work in the UX world and be a UX designer. So one of the things that we use when we're looking at products and judging whether they are good versus bad user experiences is something called the UX honeycomb. And basically, value is the core of everything that we're trying to do as designers. And around the value, all of these things. So something has to be usable, useful, desirable, accessible, credible, and findable for it to be valuable to the end user. And all of these things are, again, related to each other as well. Some of you might have been familiar, I don't think it's in this presentation, but there's something called the hierarchy of needs, which some of you might have heard of, which we use quite a lot in product. So it's a psychological kind of construct of basically a pyramid, and you have your foundational needs. So like if you're walking around the forest naked and hungry, you can't really be thinking about how to live your best life. You have to solve those needs first, and then you can build up from there. And we do the same thing in UX. So in order for something to be valuable, which is like the pinnacle of the triangle, it has to be usable and it has to be useful, and people have to want it. Otherwise, without those things, the value will never get seen. So an example of this, which I think is quite interesting, is this is Craigslist. We do have it in London. It's not everywhere in the world, but yeah, we do. Craigslist does exist. It looks like this. And I think it's a really interesting case study because it's actually very good UX in terms of it's really clear. It's just a bunch of links, and you can just scan all of the words and see something that you recognize as relating to the thing that you're looking for, and then go from there. So from that kind of value proposition perspective, it's quite good. But in terms of the look and feel, there's a lot left to do here. It's pretty much unrecognizable as a standard website in 2024. We would expect this to look very different, and a lot more pleasurable and desirable than it actually looks. But the value this is delivering is there. So it's a nice illustration of how all of these things in the UX honeycomb kind of need to work together to give something good UX. It's not just one thing over the other. All right, so moving on to what it's like to be a UX designer. I mean, again, this depends on so many different things, but lots of people do consider UX design just to be designing the interface, maybe a bit of visual design, not really much below the surface, but actually UX designers do a lot of different things, and not necessarily all at the same time. And some things will be left to different disciplines. So for example, in this list, like feature writing, maybe you'll have content people who will write that. Requirement writing, you might have a business analyst who will write that. Graphic arts, you might have a UI designer who does that. Interaction design, you might have an interaction designer who takes care of that. So within this, there are a lot of different niche kind of job roles, and you can specialize and focus in on any one of these. But UX designers generally will, if not do all of these things, be working very closely with people who do these things in their day-to-day role, because as the definition of UX states, it's not just the interaction with the thing, it's the whole experience, the end-to-end experience that you're concerned with as a UX designer. So some character traits, I guess, that are useful for UX designers. Yes, all of these things. I think being a good collaborator is super important, because in digital product teams, they are just that, they are a team, and it's rare that you'll just be working on your own. You can't really just work on your own anyway, because you need the collaboration of other people and input of other people to give you insights into the way things work and what they need to do. So collaboration is really key. Putting people first, it's really the start of design thinking. So like empathizing with people, making sure that you're understanding what the user needs and why they need it. Problem solving, absolutely. I always say that, like, some UX projects that you might hear about do sound quite dull. Like, for example, I'm working on a project at the moment for a pension company, and to me, pensions, oh my god, so dull, so important, but I just, like, I don't know how to engage with them because they're so boring. But my job on this project is really fun, because I'm having to creatively solve a lot of problems over and over again. So problem solving can be a massive outlet for creativity, which is really great. Variety, absolutely, because like, if you're working in an agency, you'll be working on multiple projects at one time. If you work from a consultancy, you'll move from client to client over the course of a year. So enjoying variety, your team members will change depending on what client you're working on, etc. Definitely need that. Being a stickler for detail, mostly, yes, I think that's important. It depends where you fall in like the UX research, UX design. Sometimes you'll need to be more detail focused, but focusing in on what you really need to find out if you're doing the research side, absolutely. And questioning things. But it's one of the things we're going to look at when we're thinking about doing like a UX kind of project in a minute. Always ask why. It can be annoying, but it's really fundamental. It's called root cause analysis. It's also the 5 whys. So just make sure you're drilling down, not just taking the first answer that people are giving you, because often there's more to it than meets the eye. So if this sounds like the way that you think about things, then UX could definitely be an interesting career move for you. Benefits of UX, absolutely. It's always in demand. Companies have definitely, over the past 10 years, recognized how fundamental and important UX is to their products. You don't have to do a degree. I mean, you can. I'm always a bit conflicted on this because I teach at General Assembly, which isn't a degree, and I teach people who come out as very strong UX designers and go on to get good UX roles just from doing like a 10-week or 12-week course or something. But also I did at one point lecture at Falmouth University on the masters in UX. So I'm kind of like, you don't have to go and do a degree, but you can if you want to. I mean, there's pros and cons for both. And I think it depends who you are and where you're at and what you want to do. But you don't need a degree, which I think is important. And there are loads of ways that you can do it. There are loads of ways in as well. I actually, before I became a graphic designer, my first role in a graphic design studio was as a project manager, because I had graphic design skills, but I had no experience, but I had experience as a project manager. So like I kind of got in to where I wanted to go in a bit of a sideways way. But I've taught people who have been bakers, who've been architects, who've been product managers, software engineers, illustrators. I'm actually working with someone who works at Red Badger, the company I work for now, who was an illustrator, came and did a class at GA, and now she's a senior UX designer. So it doesn't really matter what background you come from. Every background is important because it's human focused. So the only experience you really have to have is that of being a human, and everyone fits that criteria. So yeah, it's easy to get into in that respect. You don't need prior experience in anything other than doing what you've done. So average salaries, the average salary is quite high, and it's kind of above the national average for household income in a lot of European countries, which is positive. And if that's something that you're looking for, can be a factor in your decision making. Absolutely. Okay, so I've just seen a question come in, which I'm just going to answer before we have a quick break. So is usability part of UX? And does it have conflict with perfect UX? For example, IKEA model, assembling your desk might be delightful, but not useful to get the new desk instantly. Yes, I mean, this is a great question because it just illustrates it depends. So I think that UX and being human focused, like I just mentioned, is the important thing. That's the thing you would look at to answer this particular question. So the IKEA model, assembling your desk versus getting a desk that's ready built and you can use immediately, the kind of two humans that you'd be thinking about for either of those scenarios will have the same goal, which is to get a new desk, but they'll have different motivations. One of them perhaps might be a bit more price conscious and willing to put something together to get their desk, and the other one may not be so price conscious, may just be like, I managed to land a new contract, I don't have a desk, I need it this afternoon so that I can start my job. So it's kind of, the goal is the same, the motivations are different. And that's a really big part of UX research, is understanding your persona, understanding the type of person who is going to be using your product and why they're going to be using it. So thanks for that question. That was a nice little illustration. Okay, great. So we've been going for almost an hour. We're just going to take a break. It's 5 minutes. So get up, stretch, open a window, make sure you get a pen and paper if you haven't got one already for the activities we'll be doing next. So I'll see you in 5. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you are back. So what we're going to do now is have a look at the UX design process itself, and have a go at some of the type of things that we might be thinking about as UX designers. So you are up. You are going to have a go at solving a problem through UX design techniques. So we're going to well, I'll actually take you through it as we go. So this is what we're going to do. So we have got a problem. So our problem is that travelers in new cities often don't know where to eat for the most authentic local experience. They end up settling for chains that they're familiar with. So this could be something that has come out of a brief from a client. So the things that you're trying to solve here is the time spent searching, most likely reducing the time spent searching, unverified menus and pricing. So looking on Google, etc., the menus might be out of date, the pricing might be old, and also quality control. So is it actually going to be a good place to eat or not? So the challenge is to create a mobile app solution for travelers who want to minimize their time searching for dining options by utilizing travel guides. So consider how to solve for these problems we just saw here: out-of-date information, discovering new options, and the quality control of the restaurant and food. So quite often when we're given a design problem or something to design, it's like having like a blank page, basically, and that can be a bit scary, and you can think, where do I start? I have no idea. So this is just a cartoon to illustrate that. And I think that you can actually spend quite a lot of time going back and forth on decisions and what to do and when to do. And actually having that kind of existential crisis myself at work at the moment, because I'm building a design system and I'm trying to think of naming conventions for semantics, and it's going a bit crazy. But when we're doing this in UX, we can use a design process, which is essentially design thinking, to help us. So we can again use this as a framework to hang our process on. So research is the place that we start. Empathy, being human focused, actually looking at the humans. Defining the problem, what do these people actually need? Generating ideas, how can we possibly solve this problem in lots of different ways? Making a prototype of one of the ideas that we think is going to work the best, and then testing that and learning as we go on, iterating. So some research methods that we use: interviews, surveys, focus groups. There are lots of different ways of doing things, and please feel free to look them up afterwards. But what we're going to focus on for today is interviews. I'm not going to ask you to interview anyone, but I am going to ask you to write down some questions that you might want to ask to try and think of ideas and ways of solving this problem. So what we're going to do now, just take 3 minutes to write down a few questions that you want to ask people about their traveling habits. So don't forget, the challenge is to create this solution for people who want to minimize their time searching for places to eat when they're in a new city. Okay, so I'm going to set a timer, and your 3 minutes, just write down as many questions as you can think of, and that starts now. Okay, that was a quick 3 minutes, but there we go. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of an idea about how complicated it is to write questions, but also given you some food for thought of how you might go ahead go about solving this problem. On research questions, like, user research is very, very complex, and interviewing people is probably the most used way of doing research, but also one of the most complex in terms of the fact that it's full of a lot of traps. So I'm just going to get you to consider kind of how to ask good questions. So if I was to ask you which is the better question, would you like to have a restaurant directory app or describe how you learn about a restaurant? Yeah, anybody who wants to write your answers in the chat. But yeah, absolutely. B is a better question because it is open-ended. So would you like to have a restaurant directory app? Someone could just say, yeah, sure. Gives you nothing, doesn't give you any information about any pain points or how they do it currently or anything at all. So open-ended is good. Tell me about a time you used a travel guide, or how do you usually find places to eat while traveling? A or B? This one's hard, actually. Which one do you think is better? So I got some B's, a couple of B's. Some A's as well, yes. Okay, a class divided. All right. So basically, this one is hard given that we've just said ask open-ended questions, but actually what this question is trying to do is to focus on a specific instance. So while the first question was just trying to find out generally, this is a question that's trying to find out how people actually currently use travel guides. So the agenda for this question is a tiny bit different. But focusing on specific instances can be really handy. And then this one. So what are your frustrations about restaurant directories, or how do you feel about restaurant directories? A or B? B, A, B, A. Wow. Yes, I mean, we are trying to find out what people's frustrations are, but we're also trying to find out what they enjoy about using directories. So asking them how they feel about directories will get you both strands of that question, rather than A, which is tell me your frustrations. You only find out about frustrations. So, and it's kind of leading because it's saying to them like how it's saying like that directories are frustrating. So what are your frustrations? So it's kind of leading them to talk about things in that way. Okay, so when we've asked our interviews, generally we'll then synthesize the results, and then we'll think about how what it's actually telling us or what direction we can go in. So for example, perhaps from our interviews, we learned some of these things. I pick a place when I'm hungry, don't plan meals ahead. There are so many choices, I end up being stressed and overwhelmed. Another person, I don't like the prices can be different. It's a pain to check restaurants and confirm menus and prices. Or sometimes I try Yelp, but it takes time to sort through all the reviews and figure out the quality. I think basically what people are talking about here is analysis paralysis, right? You analyze things so much that you end up just going with the status quo, which was our original problem, that people just go for chains that they know they're going to get an okay meal, they know what to expect, because there's so much ambiguity and choice overwhelm for everything else. So this is a real whistle-stop tour, by the way. So that was the kind of empathize phase. It was thinking about how, doing some research, what questions do we want to ask, what are we trying to find out, how can we empathize and understand what people feel about this topic. The next phase in the process is to define the problem. So here we would build a problem statement. So problem statements are ways that we can very succinctly articulate the problem, so that we can communicate that with our team and the wider stakeholders, so everyone's clear kind of what goal we're aiming towards. And they come in this format. So we believe that your specific customer or persona needs a better way to what need they have because of this insight. So thinking about all of the insights that we may have gathered through our research phase, our problem statement that we come up with could be, we believe that travelers need a better way to find and compare restaurants because travel guides and review sites have too many options and are unreliable. And all of this, all of these can be traced back to our interview kind of results, things that we actually heard people say. So we've empathized, we've got a lot of data, we've analyzed that, we've figured out one of the problems. You might come up with lots of problem statements, absolutely, but you pick the one that your business wants to go with and the one that you possibly hear people talking about the most. So once we've defined that problem, then we can start thinking of ways to solve that problem. So we're just going to do a rapid sketching activity. So this is when, again, you need that pen and paper. In UX design, we sketch quite a lot. It's a nice way of us being able to make something that can be considered throwaway. If, for example, we were to go straight to our design tool to start designing these solutions, because it takes a bit more effort, you can perhaps feel a little bit more bonded to your designs and your ideas, and it can be harder to disregard them or say, actually, no, this doesn't really speak to the problem that we're trying to solve. So sketching is fast, it's cheap, it can be throwaway, it can actually help you get all of your ideas out at the beginning, and give you permission to come up with, I guess in quote marks, bad ideas. So like ways that you could solve the problem that just aren't feasible. And that can be interesting because sometimes those bad ideas can have like a grain of good in them that could actually work, that then you can move forward. But sketching also is great for getting everybody involved because everyone can draw, especially when we're talking about interfaces. It's literally just boxes and lines and text, and that's it. So what we're going to do now is, if you have a piece of paper, fold it into half twice, so you've got 4 squares, and then you have 1 minute to draw out an idea for an interface in each of those squares that may help solve this problem. I will time you and I will tell you when each minute is up. So get your pens ready, and your first minute starts now. Okay, move on to sketch 2. Okay, time is up. I mean, I'd be interested to know how you found that. I think people always get a bit scared when they have to start drawing things. And for like 1 minute per idea is really not a lot of time. But I hope that you see what I mean, that it can kind of help you let go of thinking about constraints and thinking, is this actually going to work? Because you kind of don't have time. You just have to put your ideas down. And what you would do now is you would share your ideas with your team. They'd share theirs with yours. You'd think about bits of each sketch that could potentially work, and then you can kind of start to move that forward into a prototype. So making a prototype is the next step in the process, and I think that it's important to understand that Sturgeon's law tells us that 90% of everything is crap, so you do have to test your prototypes when you as soon as you can, really. So we work in a very iterative way. It's test and learn. It's about not becoming attached to your ideas. Being a digital designer, product designer, is very different from being like a graphic designer, because you're working quite quickly, and it's not about you and your design skill. It's about solving the right problem for the right people in the right way at the right time. So yeah, testing is really important. And when I say building a prototype, I don't mean that you need to know how to code. You absolutely don't. Although from my own personal experience, I would say learning how to code, I mean, I just learned front end, so just HTML, CSS, JavaScript. It really did help me as a designer. It helped me understand my design decisions and what impact they had on code and how they were going to be built. And it helps you communicate with software engineers as well. So you don't have to know how to code at all, but if you're interested, then knowing a bit about it can be very, very helpful. So with that in mind, just talking a little bit about prototyping, I want to leave time for questions. So we're not going to do this actual activity, but you can do this after class if you're interested. Basically, for UX designers, you can prototype in paper, which is doing this, which is literally just sketching out your different screens step by step. And you can test those with people. You can kind of put them put the pieces of paper in the right order, get people to point to where they would click to do certain things. You can still learn some interesting insights through doing it that way. After paper prototyping, we may then jump into a design tool once we've got a clearer idea of what we're going to be making. We'd make some wireframes, which are just like grey box representations of things. And then eventually, once we tested those, we could start adding some visual design elements like actual imagery, some color styles, some typography, and test those prototypes as well. So prototyping and testing happens all the way through the UX process. It's not just right at the end, but as I hope you can see, like this UX design process can be very fast. So you can do all of this, get to the test and learn phase in a day, in an hour, and then test it, learn something, and then start again with those new learnings in hand. So the design process is represented quite often as a linear thing like this, but it's actually quite circular, and you just repeat the process over and over again to get closer to your final kind of product, I guess. Okay, yeah, that's it for the day. So we had quite a heavy first half of learning about UX design, what it is, what it means, and then we actually just ran through a very quick like design thinking foundational process just to give you an idea of what it's like. But congratulations on coming along, learning something. Hopefully you did. Hopefully at least you got some language that you can go away and Google if you're interested in more stuff. And yeah, that's it from me for today. So questions in a minute.
Amazing, and thank you, Clementine. Thank you for sharing your insights. There is a question. Can you post a question on the chat? And if anyone else has a question, please do post it on the chat. I'll go over some last items, reminders, and recommendations for you all. Meanwhile, we get the questions in. Clementine, can we move one slide forward, please?
Sure thing.
Super, super important. Please share your feedback with us. The reason this is super important is we do, sorry, too early for me. There we go. We do these trainings live all the time, so we're continuously updating them. The feedback you all have is super important to us, and it's useful and actionable. So whenever you get a chance, please let us know. You are going to get a copy of the slides. We're going to send an email too. So if for some reason you cannot do it right now, please check the slides and share your feedback. And thank you for pasting the link again to the feedback form. Awesome, awesome, awesome. There is one question about, for you, Clementine, what is the title of the book you recommended at the beginning?
Yeah, I just popped the answer in the chat. It's The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman. Another thing to have a look at, just typing a web address in, is the nngroup.com. So Don Norman set up this website with his pal, Jakob Nielsen. They're both like OG UX practitioners. Called the NN Group, the Nielsen Norman Group. It's very dry, but it has everything on there that you could possibly want. It has like a glossary of terms. It will give you examples of everything, YouTube videos. They do certifications and all kinds of stuff, but it's very worthwhile checking out. So that's the nngroup.com.
Amazing. And we have a new question about best tools to learn for prototyping.
So not just prototyping. I believe that the best tool for UI design, including prototyping, at the moment is Figma. And that's just figma.com, and you can get a free account. And in parallel with that, I would say go to the Figma YouTube channel, the actual official Figma YouTube channel. They invest a whole heap. I'll put the link in. They invest a lot in education. So they are really great at explaining how to do everything. And there are beginner classes. There's like a collection of videos for beginners of how to use the software. It's incredibly powerful and can seem like it's a bit scary because there's a lot of features. But to design something, you literally can just draw rectangles and write text and that's it, and then you can start prototyping. It's wildly good, so that's what I would recommend.
Amazing. Two last updates for you all. Clementine, can we move to the next slide, please?
Yeah.
In case you all are interested in learning more about UX, there are paths that students usually take at General Assembly. There's the workshop step, which is a 2 to 6 hours live online class to pick up a skill with more depth. There's also short courses if you just need to pick up the skill, but with enough hours of training that you build an actual project, a real life project. And students usually do that to either get up to date on skills or get a promotion on their career, get a leg up because they're learning a specific skill. And then there's the boot camps, which are career change programs. We're talking about 3 months full-time or 8 months part-time, where you get to build 3 to 5 real-life projects. You work with instructors enough to become ready for a job in UX design, regardless of the background you have. We have people that have migrated from social services to UX, law to UX, any profession, teachers, nurses, wherever you're at, you want to do UX, that's the program we recommend. And on the next slide, please, we have resources and links for you all to continue reading, learning. And hey, if you're interested about talking more about what GA can help you guys do for your career, there's a link there to talk to admissions. Our admissions team, it's not like a college admissions. It's not like you failed or passed. It's more of, we want to expose you to how UX designers think and work with free exercises, free workshops, and then help you decide if that's what you love, if that's what gets you fueled up and happy and more energized, and then we'll build a plan for your next step in your career. With this said, I want to thank you all for joining in today, and thanks to Google for making this happen. And Clementine, thank you for sharing your insight with us.